Came out in 1965. It was the first of 10 Amicus horror anthology films that spanned all the way from 65 obviously until 1980 with Monster Club. Monster Club is terrible. This one ended up being pretty decent. I give it a C+ overall. The first story ended up being the best, but the introduction of this it's inspired by Dead of Night, another anthology horror film that came out in 1948. It was ahead of its time. And also the 50s horror comics anthology style. Now it never reaches the level of scary or gore as in the comics. It ends up being almost like a mockery. It's all toned down because it's British. The props are basically considered ancient. The props and the special effects, they'll have like paper on string and they'll dip it up and down for a bat. And they actually used a husky for a werewolf. And they just showed him for a split second because they totally knew that everyone would know that it would be a husky or a dog. That's the first story. Well, let's just say this. It's 5 guys, they get on a train, and they end up, and the last person to board is Peter Cushing, an amazing actor. This is probably my second favorite role I've seen him in. My first is him as Frankenstein. In this one, he's the traveling gypsy tarot card reader, and he reads their fates one by one. The first story is the werewolf. This werewolf places a hex on this house and the people that stole it from him, and his ancient tomb in the basement finally gets opened, and he ends up obviously getting his revenge on the owner. Then the second story is terrible. It's about overgrown vines, and the scientists just discuss British chapter where they're like, oh well, they look at under their microscope and they're like, oh well, it's evolving to take over the world. Just terrible props. Move on. Voodoo story. These are really good in the horror comic books, but this one, they use this story to jam in a bunch of filler. It's about this musician who travels to like the Caribbean, and so they show a bunch of like concert and different bands playing music for like 2-minute scenes, and he ends up stumbling across this voodoo seance, and he steals the lyrics to their voodoo song and he uses it for his own song, and he gets haunted by the ghosts or the ancient king or ancient god that they worship, and he comes back and he takes the freaking lyrics from them. All the endings are just terrible. You never get the payoff. It's supposed to be a payoff twist where they die or whatnot or get theirs, but the payoff isn't that good the way that they show it, like in a lot of these British horror films from the 50s and 60s. Anyway, moving on. The fourth one is the Christopher Lee story, where he ends up being an art critic and he gets humiliated in public, and to get revenge on the guy, he runs over his hand. The guy was an artist, and the hand ends up haunting him and tracing him down. This is a tip. I've seen this story in a bunch of horror comics too, where the hand comes back to haunt him and chokes him to death, but he doesn't, and then he like buries it and it comes back. I forgot what the very ending was it too. Oh yeah, the hand ends up blinding him so he can't look at any art for the rest of his life. Then the fifth one is they had to do a vampire story, but we get a young Donald Sutherland. It's just terrible. The doctor like warns him like, oh, there's a vampire in this one. Your wife's a vampire, but he's a vampire too. So he wants the guy to kill him, so there's only one vampire in the area. It's a decent twist, I guess, but it was terribly done, of course. So the ending is Peter Cushing ends up being death himself, and he ends up dealing the tarot cards out to all of them, and that's their fates, is that on the train ride they all died, and they show him as death in its robe. It's pretty dope. I give it a C+ overall.